numbers coming out of it.
There wasn't a scientific reference, like a paper that somebody had submitted with like experimental data in it and like logical discussion and said, here's how come we know that HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. There was nothing out there like that. Nothing.
Can you tell me about your experience when you met Luke Montagne for the first time and you questioned him about his reference for HIV, since he is the one?
By the time I met Luke Montagne, I had met a lot of AIDS researchers at meetings, and I had always gone up to them if they talked like they knew about HIV and AIDS. I always went up to them afterwards and I said, where can I find a scientific reference that I can use for my, remember I said I had a sentence there, it said HIV is the probable cause of AIDS, and I needed to have that backed up by something before I could write it and submit it. And I went around, I asked a whole lot of people. I said, well, the people, I can't find it. First I looked for it, just in computer searching kind of stuff like that. But then I said, there's got to be somebody that knows this. You go to experts and ask them. And so I asked all these people one after the other, and none of them had it. None of them. And I was getting really freaked about that. That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham. It's ridiculous. But then finally Montagne came to there was a special little seminar down in San Diego where an old friend of Robert Gallo's, Flossie Wongstall, was opening up a Department of AIDS research down in San Diego. They had big, lots of money involved, federal money. And they had Montagne come there and give a talk. And after that, they had a little wine and cheese thing. And I went over to Montagne afterwards and I said, Dr. Montagne, I can't find a reference. I can't find a reference to go with the statement HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. I'm sure you can help me. And he knew that he probably should be able to help me. And he said, well, why don't you quote this new work? And by new, he meant like something that came out this year. Right? This new work about a virus that can kill monkeys. Or I think it was not monkeys, it was like something related to monkeys, some kind of a baby, a little ape. And I had read that and I said, it was like supposedly going to be a model system for studying AIDS, that somebody had figured out some kind of retrovirus that passing it back and forth between various mammals, they could finally put it into chimpanzees and kill them. And it killed them in about a week. And it didn't kill them there was nothing like AIDS there. It doesn't kill you in a week. This is totally ridiculous. None of the symptoms were the same. And I said, well, I read that paper and I didn't see any connection between that and AIDS, and I don't think that would be I wouldn't want to use that as a reference. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but I know he walked away. Oh, no, before he told me about that paper, he said, why don't you use the NIH, like with the CDC report? And I said, well, I looked at that, and that was not a scientific paper. And then he said, what about this other thing, this like paper that had just come out about a month before, and a lot of fanfare associated with that paper, but it was total crap. It was like, yeah, if you get $2 million, you can figure out how to kill a primate with a retrovirus. So what? It doesn't have anything to do with AIDS. It didn't look like AIDS. It didn't smell like AIDS. It wasn't AIDS. It was just a kind of retrovirus that can kill a chimpanzee. So what? So I didn't get any more out of him. He walked away after that. And the people standing around, by the way, who were his colleagues there, looked at him like they were thinking he should come up with a better answer than that. But he couldn't, and he just turned around and walked away. I really thought he'd have an answer. I really did. I mean, that was my last. I was right at the edge of my faith in the system, but I thought Montagne will know why he thinks HIV causes it, and he'll tell me. He'll say, because of this study, but he didn't have that. None of those guys have that, and that's why they're so weird. That's why they don't want to say. They don't want people like me walking up and asking them those kind of questions, and they're willing to go to great lengths to prevent that. They're out on a limb. I wouldn't want to be there with them.
Almost chilling words at the end there from Mullis. They don't want people like him, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, around asking questions, and that they are willing to go to great lengths to prevent that. Mullis was indeed a thorn in the side of the establishment during the time of the HIV/AIDS debate. He was very outspoken towards people like Dr. Fauci. Here's a quote from Mullis on Fauci from a lengthy but fantastic article called "Was the COVID-19 test meant to detect the virus?" Quote, "What ABC needs to do is talk to Fauci and Gallo and show their assholes, which I could do in 10 minutes," end quote. Now, personally, without knowing Mullis, I have to admit that I like him. And I have little doubt in my mind, from my own point of view, that if he were alive today, the powers that be would not be able to use PCR to perpetuate this manufactured crisis in the way that they are right now today. He was a thorn in their side then, and I'm sure he would have been an even bigger thorn in their side now. Now, this raises suspicions with me regarding the timing of his death just weeks before the outbreak. No disrespect to the family, and I have no proof at this point to go off of that. But again, the timing does raise some questions, I think, that should be looked into. Now, I'm going to play some more clips here. And some of these clips were sent to me. Some of them were put together by other people doing some great work out there, showing how the manipulation is taking place, and several examples of doctors calling out the lies.
Good afternoon, and we're starting off with the overall rates in terms of confirmed cases. As you can see on this graph, the numbers are now going up and going up really much more rapidly.
The test that we have for the virus does not tell us whether we have an active virus in a person. It's being called by the media a case.
And the UK has recorded almost 3,000 new cases of coronavirus.
The rise in the number of cases that we've seen today is concerning.
A case is when someone gets sick from a disease. That's completely different from a positive test.
It's not a case at all. It's just that we can detect that at some time in the past, perhaps there has been viral infection, but it's probably been removed now.
Even if there is some asymptomatic transmission, in all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks.
You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6. And if you do, you will be breaking the law.
It has what's been calculated as an infection fatality rate. That is, if you catch the infection, probability of you dying is 0.3%. So that means that 99.7% of people survive. 80% of people who catch this virus will be completely asymptomatic. Those people who do catch the virus, many of them, the effect will be like a bad flu. Those people who are actually hospitalized, then we do have very good treatments for these.
And anyone breaking the rules risks being dispersed, fined, and possibly arrested. As your Prime Minister, I must do what is necessary to stop the spread of the virus and to save lives.
The government reaction is causing more deaths now and will cause far more deaths in the future than the virus itself.
Positive tests do not equal cases. Very important to remember. And I think that many would agree the response has been worse than the crisis itself. Now, here is Dr. Thomas Cowan breaking down the PCR test and how it can be used to manipulate the crisis.
The test is called a RT-PCR test. It's otherwise known as a viral load test. And the test is a surrogate test. It was developed by a guy named Kary Mullis, who was given the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for essentially inventing the technique of this test. And he said very specifically, you cannot use this test to either prove infectious etiology or to diagnose an infectious disease, which of course is interesting because if you can't use it to diagnose an infectious disease, that of course begs the question of what can you use it for? But let me back up here and describe what a surrogate test means, because this is very important to understanding the situation we're currently in. A surrogate test means that in a situation where you're trying to prove causation, you have to have a gold standard test. And those postulates, like with meningococcus, that is a gold standard test. It's reliable 100% of the time. You cannot use a surrogate test to prove anything. And that is what is happening with these tests. So what is the surrogate test? So remember that we don't have a gold standard. We don't have isolation, purification, reinfection. We don't have viremia. We don't have millions of copies demonstrated on an electron microscope. We essentially have no idea who has this coronavirus disease. So then they take a piece of one of the coronaviruses, the new one that they found. It has a new RNA sequence that hasn't been found before. They take one of the sequences, which they say is unique to that particular virus, and they do something called amplify it. And what that means is you take in your blood, you'll have one copy of this sequence, and it's too small, you can't find it. So you stimulate it, and this is what Kerry Mullis came up with. You stimulate it, it makes 2 copies. That's 1 cycle. You make 4 copies. That's 2. You make 2 to the 20th copies, whatever number that is. That's 20 cycles. And what you find with this test is that once you put it through approximately 36 cycles, then you start to see the color change that tells you it's positive. So if you do 35 cycles, it's still too small to see. If you do 36, you start to see it, but you get false negatives, even though you don't really know which is a false negative because you don't have anything to compare it with. So then you do 37 and you see it, 5% of the time of people with these symptoms, and you say that's the number. But here's where it gets interesting. If you do it 40 times, you start seeing a lot more positives. And then here's something else to know. If you do it 60 times, so if you amplify it over and over and over again, it becomes positive with 100% of the people. Let me say that again. If you amplify it 60 times, it will be positive with everybody. That means that everybody has a piece of this RNA somewhere in their cells or in their genome or somewhere in their secretions. All you have to do is amplify it enough. And the problem is we don't know how many false positives or false negatives there are because we have nothing to compare to. And if all biological tests have false positives, so if you test 30 million people and you have a 1% false positive rate, then 300,000 people by definition will test positive, and then you have an epidemic. And then if you want to demonstrate that the epidemic got better, all you have to do is lower the amplification cycles to 35, and then suddenly your vitamin C or your vaccine or your chloroquine or whatever you did worked, and now there's no more people testing positive. That is fraught with problems, and that is the problem. And unfortunately, with every country has their own standard of what kind of cycles they put it through, the number. So you see very different numbers coming out of very different places, depending on the number of amplification cycles that they're standardizing their test to. And I hope everybody is getting the point that this is a crazy situation.
A crazy situation indeed. A manufactured crisis, in my opinion. A very astute point made by Dr. Cowan. Depending on the amount of amplifications, you can affect the positive or negative rates. So you could have a very high amplification rate in the numbers, and therefore would have a very high positivity rate in the cases or the tests, right? Then you roll out the vaccine and lower the amplification during the tests, and then you would get less positive cases, right? And hey, wouldn't you know it, then you have an effective vaccine. Now, this last clip is from Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis having a conference last week speaking with the doctor about testing, contact tracing, and the lockdowns. By the way, Governor DeSantis said previously that Florida would never again lock down while he is governor. I wish my governor would say the same.
Not just general testing and PCR testing, whether you should test asymptomatic people, just symptomatic, how many contacts. Dr. Bhattacharya, what is the this asymptomatic testing with PCR, but particularly I think one of the things that's been put out, the New York Times had an article about a month ago looking at some of the test results in New York and in, I believe, Nevada and Massachusetts. And they found that because the PCR tests are so sensitive, that up to 90% of the positives were not identifying live infectious virus. And then I think there's other studies that have come out. I know Oxford's Center for Evidence-Based Medicine says that if you have such high sensitivity, you cannot be there's no guarantee you're even identifying live virus. And I think that, I guess, one, just what does that mean for some of the testing and the case numbers that we see? But then two, it seems to me that if you're test positive with no symptoms with a very sensitive PCR test, and they can't even tell you if you're infectious, we're quarantining across the country probably hundreds of thousands or millions of people who aren't even contagious. And I think that obviously has a huge cost to society. Doesn't seem to be getting a lot of discussion though.
The key thing about the PCR technology that I think is important for this discussion is that essentially you're doubling the genetic material if it's present, or the virus if it's present, right? If you have a very tiny amount of the virus, or if it's a viral fragment that's not actually that your body is successfully attacked, immune system is successfully attacked, then what you're amplifying is something that's not going to pose any risk either to you or to others. So you're asymptomatic. The PCR, you're positive with the PCR. It's not a false positive in a technical sense, but in a functional sense, it's a false positive. Epidemiologically, it's a false positive, right? I'm not going to infect you, even though I have this even though I'm PCR positive, because it took so many millions to reach what really was very much genetic material for the virus present to begin with. I think that you're absolutely right when you attach it to a policy of contact tracing and isolation and quarantine. We effectively are quarantining people on the basis of PCR tests, where it will have no effect on disease spread because they're not infectious. And at the same time, will impose enormous costs on them. There's another follow-on cost of that, is that it makes people less willing to cooperate with contact tracers because they know the costs. If I am contact traced and I'm asked to say who I've interacted with, I know if I say I interact with my friend, they're going to be facing the same thing. They might get quarantined, and if it's likely it's possible as a false positive, a functional false positive, then I'm imposing costs on them for nothing. I think in LA County, I saw an LA Times story that 60% of people who are contacted, who put in touch with contact tracers, they won't cooperate with them, and you can see why. The cost essentially ratting your friends out is enormous. The cost has been enormous, and it's been affecting billions of people around the world. There are so many more clips of other doctors and experts that I could have included, but I think you get the point. Personally, I believe, as I have previous reports, that this is part of a much larger agenda, and this is a manufactured crisis, but it's the mechanism, it's the vehicle to transition in from this. The window of opportunity to change course diminishes more and more each passing day in history that will determine humanity's future. I hope you found this report useful. Thanks for watching.